Patrick Bateman is a 27-year-old businessman working for Pierce & Pierce. Though he may appear on the surface to just be a regular guy working on Wall Street, hidden in plain sight is his cold-blooded desire to torture, maim, and kill, with a bloodlust that seems to target women in particular.
You're a fucking ugly bitch. I want to stab you to death, then play around with your blood.
He's highly fashionable, a man of routine, and always has the best excuse to get out of unwanted social situations. Throughout his story, he is frequently mistaken for or takes the identity of various other people, such as Marcus Halberstam.
Then let's do it, Marcus. Great party.
Thanks. Patrick, why is he calling you Marcus?
And a certain Paul Owen. Paul Owen, you may say? Isn't his name Paul Allen? Yes, it may be so in the movie, but for this video I'll be discussing events portrayed in the original book, which, unlike the movie, came out before Kira was introduced as a character in Diamond is Unbreakable, thus making it a potential source of inspiration for Kira Yoshikage. I know some of you might have been chomping at the bit to tell me I was wrong since Kira existed long before the movie was a thing, but yes, American Psycho was originally a novel that came out and was translated for the Japanese market shortly before Kira's creation. American Psycho appears to have been first released in Japan on December 18th, 1992. Kira's first appearance in the Diamond is Unbreakable manga was in Volume 8, Chapter 69, the cover date of which was October 4th, 1993 as part of Weekly's Shonen Jump, leaving the greater part of a year for Araki to have read the novel and taken inspiration from the titular character that is Patrick Bateman. As a matter of fact, Araki even stated in an interview that when he was making Diamond is Unbreakable, he had the initial assumption that a serial killer would be the enemy, but didn't imagine Kira Yoshikage as a specific character from the start. Tumblr user Lord Dio got to attend a Q&A session done by Naokatsu Suda, David Productions' chief director for the anime adaptation of parts 1 through 4, at Anime Boston 2017. In part of their post, which I will have linked in the description, they write about their experience that it was interesting to hear that Araki had approached them when they started part 4 to ask them to add in the foreshadowing scenes with Kira, because when he was writing it, he didn't know who the main villain would be, and if he had known, this is how he would have wanted it to have been. I believe both these sources illustrate that Kira Yoshikage was not planned out as a character from the start of part 4, which lends credence to my idea that American Psycho and Patrick Bateman, amongst many other things, were an inspiration for his character, which I'll be diving into right now. Starting things off, if you watch the movie, you might be thinking to yourself, Patrick's dialogue about his morning routine sounds eerily similar to Kira's own monologue about his life that he made to Shigechi, so that's clearly one of the major points of inspiration Araki took when making Kira, right? Wrong. Though this dialogue sounds very similar, it is not present in the same form within the novel. In fact, during the sequence in the novel, Patrick doesn't even mention his name or age even once. It's literally just a nearly 5-page monologue on his morning routine that day, which the movie shortens down and changes a bit, as well as adding on his famous "there's an idea of a Patrick Bateman" line, which is actually just one part of a monologue made near the ending of the book, which the movie then attempts to complete during its own ending. So no, that isn't it. Though you can make the argument that the idea to have Kira monologue in the first place was inspired by the fact that in the novel Patrick does so constantly. In fact, there are multiple pages dedicated to his interpretations of the musical careers of Whitney Houston and Huey Lewis in the news. At most, the best argument for inspiration you can make here is the fact that both share in having a strange monologue focused around routine. And if that is indeed the case, you could even say that Kira's other strange monologues might be inspired by those frequently made by Patrick Bateman. But it's my opinion that while that could be the case, the more likely sources of inspiration are more subtle than that. I'll just say a certain stray cat took me down this rabbit hole, which led me to find various winks here and nudges there that seem to allude to Patrick Bateman. Starting off with the obvious. Both are well-dressed office workers who live double lives as serial killers, but to the public they just seem like ordinary people. The author of American Psycho, Bret Easton Ellis, in his book titled White, says there were two Patrick Batemans. There was the handsome and socially awkward boy next door whose name no one could remember because he seemed like everybody else, having conformed like everybody else. And there was the nocturnal Bateman, who roamed the streets looking for prey, asserting his monstrousness, his individuality. This idea is made apparent very many times throughout American Psycho, such as when he is asked why he continues to work despite not needing to financially, he responds with,
"Because I want to fit in."
Along with the fact that outside of his so-called work at PNP as vice president, he is often found looking for victims. This ability to blend in does not always appear to be a conscious effort on his part, as various times throughout the story he will just straight up tell people he's a murderer or describe his crimes to them, and it always seems to go in one ear and out the other.
So what do you do?
I'm into, murders and executions mostly.
Do you like it?
Well, it depends. Why?
Well, most guys I know who work in mergers and acquisitions really don't like it.
At the same time, he would attempt to cover things up, even though in many of his killings, his guilt should have been glaringly obvious. Yes, it's true he doesn't just murder in broad daylight for everyone to see, but at the same time, it's like he's begging to be noticed. Kira, on the other hand, completely embraces the idea of not standing out, so he can continue to pursue his desire for a quiet life while embracing his need to kill as just part of his nature. And he always makes sure to leave behind no evidence. Like Patrick, Kira appears to the public as a completely different person, being described by a coworker as someone who is hardworking, competent, but lacks passion, also appearing to have an elegant, sort of high-class look and demeanor that makes him popular with the ladies at work, saying also that he's not a bad guy, but he's a nobody, the kind of man who just fades into the background. When Koichi meets him for the first time, he narrates, "I hadn't imagined the killer's face looking this ordinary, but behind that face he carried a stain as dark and evil as that of any villain." Another similarity outside these characters' shared ordinary appearance is the fact that they both have perfect get-out-of-jail-free cards that they use to get out of unwanted social situations. Patrick Bateman with the aforementioned constant need to
return some videotapes,
and Kira with needing to deliver important documents. Despite the fact that Kira only uses this line once, context makes it apparent that he frequently uses it as an excuse to avoid outings with his coworkers, one of them even describing him as a gopher for the company, meaning they've definitely bought his excuse. When the Morio crew investigate the Kira estate, Okuyasu asks Koichi when looking through the fridge, "What'll we do if we come across one of the victim's severed heads, or like her sliced body parts or something?" saying that he heard serial killers like to store corpses away like ham in a fridge. This might be a reference to when Patrick killed a woman and kept her head in his freezer. Also, it appears that in the original Japanese, the sliced body parts Okuyasu mentioned are actually breasts. Now, it isn't written whether or not Patrick kept his breasts in the fridge or freezer, but amongst the various unspeakable acts he did to the breasts of his victims, there was a time where instead of, I don't know, hooking them up to a battery with jumper cables, he just chopped them off. Yeah, if you can't tell, the movie's fairly tame compared to the book, but in any case, there's more to go through, so how about a palate cleanser? Let's talk about fashion. I'd estimate almost a quarter of the book is dedicated to either describing what someone is wearing, or detailing how one should dress when wearing certain articles of clothing. And within that mundane, nonsensical haze, we learn that Patrick shares a very similar fashion sense as Kira. Many times when describing his outfits, he's wearing Valentino. On various occasions, this includes suit jackets. Kira himself wears a light Valentino suit as seen in the Sheer Heart Attack arc. On his character page, his favorite fashion brand is listed as Gianfranco Ferré. Patrick at one point wears an outfit that incorporates a belted trench coat in black leather by Gianfranco Ferré. Quite a coincidence if I do say so myself. Also, when Detective Kimball first shows up to his office, Patrick gets on the phone and pretends to give fashion advice to someone over it, saying there are definitely do's and don'ts, good buddy, of wearing a bold striped shirt. A bold striped shirt calls for a solid colored or discreetly patterned suits and ties. Now, Kira himself wears a bold striped shirt as well as a solid colored suit, but his tie certainly isn't that. And it most definitely isn't discreetly patterned, but he's Kira. He gets to break the rules. Araki also stated in another interview that Kira may be a troubled person, but his entire train of thought is focused on the idea of winning. Patrick Bateman also appears to be focused on winning as well, always wanting to be on the top of his social group, having the best business card, handling the Fisher account, and trying to make reservations at the ever-elusive Dorsia. Though Kira's version of winning doesn't revolve around wealth and social status, instead focusing on having a quiet life, he holds a firm belief that he can overcome the challenges that face him. Next up is the identity swap. We all know what happens to Kira Yoshikage and how he takes on the identity of Kosaku Kawajiri in an attempt to reclaim his quiet life. I believe most people who've watched the movie might think Patrick pretending to be Paul Owen / Alan is what I'm referring to, but that's not quite it. While the movie exaggerates that part and makes it more of an explicit thing, in the book it's more of a case of mistaken identity. He's only ever referred to as Paul once by Christy, the prostitute he picked up, despite seemingly never giving her his name. Even though at one point he uses Paul's apartment and Gold American Express card to hire 2 escort girls that he subsequently murders, it doesn't ever seem that using Paul's identity is a big focus for him. He even describes the writing he made on the wall with their blood that read "I am back," which I imagine some could mistake as an attempt to pin the crime on Paul, as his own confused warning. So I think it'd be a pretty hard sell to say Paul became Patrick's stolen identity, and this was the fact that inspired Araki to cause Kira to swap lives with Kosaku. Notice how I mentioned specifically mistaken identity earlier? That's where I believe the inspiration comes from. Throughout the book, Patrick is often mistaken for various different coworkers of his. It's actually a pretty essential theme that the book likes to harp on. The person he is most often mistaken for is Marcus Halberstam. In fact, this is the person who Paul Owen continually mistakes Patrick to be. About this, Patrick himself says, "But for some reason it really doesn't matter, and it seems like a logical faux pas since Marcus works at P&P also. In fact, does the exact thing I do, and he also has a penchant for Valentino suits and clear prescription glasses, and we share the same barber at the same place, the Pierre Hotel, so it seems understandable. It doesn't irk me." In one chapter, he was invited to a U2 concert, and when he found out Paul Owen was coming, he tried to call Cecilia Wagner, Marcus's girlfriend, since Paul thought that Patrick was Marcus. When everyone is taking the limo to the concert, Paul calls him Marcus multiple times, as well as calling his girlfriend Evelyn, Cecilia. Patrick notes that no one has corrected him and is unlikely anyone will. In fact, in all their interactions, Patrick never corrects him and lets him to continue to believe that he is Marcus. When attending a Christmas party and talking with Paul, he still plays at this game, trying to pry into Paul's work on the Fisher account. At some point, Patrick's girlfriend Evelyn gets brought into the conversation, and despite the fact he continually tries to call her Cecilia, she fails to realize what is going on and calls him Patrick multiple times instead of Marcus, which causes Patrick to pull her into the kitchen and tell her that he wants to leave, even though she's the one running the party. He tells her that he's on the verge of hysteria, panicked that Paul Owen, or worse, Marcus Halberstam, is going to walk into the kitchen, clearly showing he doesn't want this convenient mask to slip. He then tries to get one of the cabs that are reserved outside, hoping to take Paul Owen's. He initially introduces himself as Pat Bateman, but it's the wrong cab. When he finds Paul's, he does the same thing, but when he asserts that Paul gave him permission to use the cab, he corrects himself and says that he's Marcus Halberstam. Despite the fact the cabbie knows he initially called himself Pat Bateman and probably doesn't care, during the ride, he makes sure the driver corrects himself and refers to him as Mr. Halberstam. Later on in the story, he makes reservations for Texarkana under the name Marcus Halberstam, where he's meeting Paul Owen for dinner. During the dinner, he attempts to lighten the mood to get Paul to speak and accidentally calls himself Patrick, but corrects himself.
Jeez, Patrick. Marcus, what are you thinking?
When Paul starts speaking about information regarding the Fisher account that Patrick is already aware of, he interjects with things like "this is enlightening," while at the same time telling him,
I like to dissect girls. Did you know I'm utterly insane?
He almost gets to the point of saying Marcus's girlfriend has 2 vaginas and that they're planning to get married, but is interrupted. We all know what happens next. Patrick takes him to his apartment, still being mistaken for Halberstam, and gets killed. From there, Patrick goes to Paul's apartment and makes it appear that he left for London, even going so far as to leave a new message on the phone pretending to be Paul. Apparently their voices sound similar, and over the phone it would probably sound identical. When confronted by Detective Kimball on Paul's disappearance, it's plain to see that things don't add up. It was verified by Paul's secretary that he had dinner with Marcus, but he denied it and had an alibi, and that in fact Marcus was noted as being with Patrick and others at Atlantis that night. But things don't really go anywhere with the detective, and Patrick is able to weasel his way out of things. Despite this, he continues to use Marcus's identity one more time when he has Christy back over to his place alongside a new girl, Elizabeth. Despite the fact that she calls him Patrick, when she's on the phone with her dealer inquiring for his services and asks Patrick where they're at, Patrick replies with Marcus Halberstam's, clearly not wanting the events that follow to be pinned on himself. Anyway, she doesn't even get the name right, and because she didn't get the house number, she gives up on it and plans to get in touch later, which unfortunately she doesn't live to see. Though Marcus Halberstam appears to be the other identity Patrick uses most, the whole book continually plays on the theme of mistaken identity and just how similar everyone is. The consequences of this can be seen when Patrick talks to his lawyer Carnes about the confession he left him, and almost immediately ends up being mistaken for someone named Davis. And despite his assertion that he's the one who left the confession, and that it in fact was not a joke as Carnes believes it to be, he gets dismissed, with Carnes saying it's not possible, as he had dinner with Paul Owen twice in London 10 days ago. Adding insult to injury, he excuses himself, whilst referring to Patrick as Donaldson, who is an entirely different person to the Davis he is referred to as in the beginning. Just like what I mentioned about earlier with the author Bret Easton Ellis putting in his book White, that there was a Patrick who was the handsome and socially awkward boy next door whose name no one could remember because he seemed like everybody else, having conformed like everybody else. Take that idea of conforming a few steps further and you could easily arrive at Yoshikage Kira, who did everything he could to not stand out intentionally from the start. Just like with Patrick, there too was another Yoshikage. He too was able to assert his monstrousness and individuality outside the face of his public life through the hunting of his prey. He was so skilled at putting on a front and being unmemorable that he too was able to take on another man's identity, which he probably would have gotten away with if it wasn't for Hayato Kawajiri. If the similarities I've shown here today have still yet to convince you, then I'm not sure what to say. But I have one more ace up my sleeve. Stray cat. I feel this fact, when taken in consideration with everything else presented here, paints a clear picture that Araki was in fact influenced by American Psycho's Patrick Bateman. That, or everything here, is just one hell of a coincidence. Close to the very end of the story, Patrick is experiencing disintegration, which he is taking in stride. He describes that his ATM has started speaking to him, at times leaving weird messages on the screen in green text such as, "Cause a terrible scene at Sotheby's," "Kill the president," or "Feed me a stray cat." Now, I'm not sure how they chose to write this in the Japanese release, but the terms typically used for stray cat are simple, and with Araki's knowledge on bands such as the Stray Cats, I don't see it being too much of a leap for him at the time to make the connection between the two. Potentially, this event made him think about the band Stray Cats and gave him the inspiration to name Tama, who became a plant stand hybrid, Stray Cat, referencing both American Psycho and the band. You might think, oh, but Araki doesn't understand English, so there's no chance. Well, I say based on the name of various stands throughout Diamond is Unbreakable and how they relate back to their designs and abilities, I don't think that argument holds water. Though he often claims he doesn't know English, and this is corroborated by others, I imagine as a mangaka that often uses English words and names in his works that he had access to a Japanese English dictionary, and probably already has some knowledge on the meaning of these band names in his own language. Look at the naming and appearance of stands such as Aqua Necklace and Bad Company. The kanji in their names means pretty much the same thing as their English counterparts. In fact, the furigana, which is a reading aid for kanji for Bad Company, spells out that the kanji is meant to be read out as Bad Company, like the band. Now this is a reading made up by Araki, but the original Japanese reading means the same thing, with Goku Aku meaning heinous, and Chutai meaning company, specifically the same company used to refer to a military unit. So really all it would have taken was for Araki to have known the meaning behind the band name Stray Cats in Japanese before reading the novel for him to be able to recall it. And based on just how obsessed he is with music and bands and everything, I don't think it's an impossibility. Altogether, I believe the fact that both of them blend in and go unnoticed, seem to often use get out of jail free cards, share similar interests and tastes in fashion down to wearing the same brand of jacket, have mindsets focused on winning, are both office workers who lead double lives as serial killers. Okuyasu's dialogue about the habits of serial killers, which sounds a lot like a reference to American Psycho, the fact that both experience using the identity of another person, the commonality of both stories containing something to do with a stray cat, and maybe even the fact that both have a monologue involving routine, points to American Psycho and Patrick Bateman being one out of many sources of inspiration he took in the making of Kira Yoshikage. Anyway, what do you think? Was Araki inspired by Patrick Bateman and the events of American Psycho? Do you think that this whole video was a stretch and that I'm utterly insane for thinking so? Leave your thoughts in the comments down below, swing at that like button like the axe that went into Paul Owen's head, and subscribe for more JoJo videos from the utterly insane. Till next time, farewell.